The burned Lamborghini was dragged into the Nevada auction yard on a flatbed trailer while 200 people laughed. The body was warped beyond recognition, the windshield reduced to nothing but jagged crystals fused into the doorframe, and the engine bay was coated in a thick layer of black carbon that turned the Italian alloy beneath it into something resembling charcoal. Nobody in that crowd believed the car was worth anything more than scrap weight. When the lone man in the worn jacket raised his bidding card and called out $1,200, the laughter doubled in volume and spread to every corner of the lot. Nobody looked twice at the beat-up pickup truck parked at the far end of the row, or at the 9-year-old boy sitting quietly on the tailgate. Nobody knew that years before this moment, the man in the worn jacket had designed the combustion architecture living inside that ruined engine, and that he had just spotted something that a $400 million insurance company had failed to see. If you appreciate a comeback built on real intelligence rather than luck, stay until the very last word. The auction yard in Henderson, Nevada operated on the same principle every week: move the inventory fast, move it loud, and keep the dealers happy with low reserves and fast gavels. On a Saturday morning in late October, the lot was packed with the usual flood of exotic collision salvage: a red Ferrari with its nose folded back like a paper fan, a McLaren with the driver's side entirely caved in, a Porsche GT3 RS that had met a freeway barrier at triple-digit speed. The dealers knew these cars. They knew the repair math, the parts markets, the rebuild timelines, and the final auction values. They moved through the rows with clipboards and phones, speaking in the clipped shorthand of men who had reduced beauty to columns of numbers. At the very back of the lot, roped off with yellow caution tape and left conspicuously alone, sat the car that would end the morning the way none of them expected. A Lamborghini Aventador SVJ, or what had once been one, rested on its transport dolly in a condition that made several dealers physically wince. The paint was entirely gone, replaced by a matte surface of scorched carbon and bubbled aluminum that caught the morning light in the ugliest way possible. The interior was a hollow black shell. The wheels on the passenger side had partially melted into abstract shapes. It was the kind of car that made experienced men shake their heads not with sadness but with the satisfied certainty that some things are simply finished. The crowd that gathered around the Aventador was not there to bid. They were there to watch, to point, and to make the jokes that had apparently been circulating since the car arrived on the transporter. One dealer in a pressed polo shirt told the man next to him that somebody had finally built a toaster big enough for Italian bread. Another voice from the back of the crowd called it the national rotisserie of Lamborghini. A third man, heavyset with a gold watch that caught the sun, announced to nobody in particular that the only people who should be bidding were scrapyards and comedians. The laughter that followed was genuine, loose, and entirely unself-conscious, the kind of laughter that happens when a group of people all share the same certainty and feel comfortable in it. They were comfortable because they were right. By every conventional measure, the car in front of them had no value. And then Caleb Walker walked through the gate. He was 38 years old and he looked like a man who had spent the past several years being slightly colder and slightly more tired than he should have been. The jacket was a dark navy canvas work coat, washed so many times that the elbows had gone pale. His boots were steel-toed and practical. He had a face that was sharp and quiet at the same time, the kind of face that processed information without advertising the fact, and his eyes moved across the auction lot with a methodical precision that an observer might have confused for mild boredom if they had not been watching closely. Walking beside him, one hand tucked into the pocket of his hoodie, was Owen Walker, 9 years old, thin, with his father's same habit of watching things more carefully than children usually do. Owen had been coming to salvage auctions with his father since he was old enough to sit still, and he had learned early that his job at these events was to stay quiet and pay attention. He was very good at both. The dealers nearest the burned Lamborghini noticed Caleb the moment he stopped at the caution tape. One of them, the man with the gold watch, called out with the cheerful contempt of someone who has never had a reason to be careful with his words. He asked whether Caleb was there to pick up spare parts or whether he was planning to raise chickens in the engine bay. A few people laughed. Someone else asked if he could even afford the tires, assuming any of them still held their shape. Caleb did not look at the man. He did not look at any of them. He was looking at the car, and the way he was looking at it was unlike anything anyone in that yard had seen before. He was not looking at the body damage or the melted wheels or the destroyed interior. He was looking at the burn pattern, the specific, precise geography of where the fire had started, how it had moved, which surfaces had been exposed to direct flame and which had been exposed to radiant heat from a distance. He was reading the car the way a doctor reads an X-ray, with the calm efficiency of someone who already knows which questions to ask. What Caleb Walker saw in those first 90 seconds was not a destroyed supercar. He saw a combustion signature that moved in the wrong direction. In a fuel-fed engine fire, the burn pattern originates at or near the fuel source and radiates outward in a shape determined by airflow and gravity. This fire had not done that. The char distribution across the engine bay suggested a thermal event that had propagated backward, against the natural fuel path, in a pattern consistent with a specific type of ignition system failure, one that Caleb recognized not from a textbook but from memory. From his own work. He also noticed that 2 of the module brackets near the firewall were empty in a way that was too clean, too deliberate, the bolts removed rather than burned away. And he noticed the color of the alloy along the left bank of the engine block, a shade of oxidized silver that should not have been possible if the fire had truly reached the temperatures a total loss claim would require. He stepped back from the tape, turned to Owen, and said nothing for a moment. Owen looked up at him. Then, in the quiet voice of a child who had been watching his father think for 9 years and had learned to read the silences, Owen asked whether this was the car his father had once helped build. Caleb was still for 3 full seconds. Then he turned back toward the auction table, picked up a bidding card from the registration desk, and raised it when the auctioneer opened the floor. $1,200. The room erupted. To understand what Caleb Walker saw in that engine bay, it helps to understand what Caleb Walker once was. 14 years earlier, he had been the kind of engineer that large automotive companies spend decades trying to find and usually never do, someone who understood combustion not as a mechanical process to be managed but as a physical phenomenon to be shaped. He had grown up in Ohio, the son of a machinist, and had developed his obsession with internal combustion engines the way some children develop obsessions with music. By ear, by instinct, by spending hours alone with the thing until it stopped being a mystery and started being a language. He had graduated from Michigan with a graduate degree in mechanical and thermal engineering, had turned down 3 domestic offers, and had accepted instead an invitation from Lamborghini's high-performance development division in Sant'Agata Bolognese. He had been 24 years old. He had been, by almost every available measure, extraordinary. The project that defined his time there was not something that appeared in any press release. It was an internal initiative known only as Phoenix Ignition Mapping, a proprietary system Caleb had designed over the course of 2 years that addressed one of the most persistent limitations in high-output naturally aspirated engines, the gap between the driver's throttle input and the engine's actual combustion response at extreme RPM ranges. Phoenix worked by modeling thermal feedback in real time and adjusting ignition timing at the individual cylinder level, effectively eliminating the brief hesitation that even the best production engines exhibited at the edge of their performance envelope. The result, in controlled testing, was an engine that felt alive in a way that no production V12 had ever felt before. The engineers who drove the prototype mules came back from the test track with the particular expression of people who have encountered something they cannot fully explain. Caleb had been quietly proud. He had also been careful, because Phoenix had a condition built into its architecture, a thermal boundary that, if breached through incorrect firmware calibration, would cause the system to enter a runaway feedback loop. The temperatures involved were not theoretical. They were catastrophic. He had flagged this in every internal report, had built in a hardware-level cutoff, and had been explicit that the system required a minimum of 8 additional months of thermal cycling validation before it was ready for production. Sebastian Hale had arrived at Sant'Agata on behalf of the investment and insurance consortium backing the project's commercialization, and he had arrived with a deadline. The consortium had structured its position around a specific model year launch window, and that window was closing. Sebastian was 51 years old at the time of their first meeting, a compact, well-dressed man with the surface warmth of someone who had spent his career making difficult conversations feel reasonable. He had explained to the division leadership, with charts and projected revenue figures and the particular confidence of someone who knows he holds the money, that the validation timeline needed to be compressed. He had explained that the thermal cutoff could be addressed in a post-launch firmware update. He had explained that the risk was manageable. When Caleb stood in the meeting room and said, clearly and without ambiguity, that the risk was not manageable and that releasing Phoenix in its current state was a decision that would eventually kill someone, the room had gone very quiet. 3 weeks later, Caleb's name had been removed from the internal project documentation. A month after that, his contract had been terminated. He had been handed a non-disclosure agreement and a check that felt, in retrospect, like the price of a man's professional existence. He had signed it because he was 26, because he was alone in a foreign country, and because he had not yet learned the full cost of trusting institutions. He flew back to Ohio with a duffel bag and a knowledge base that no longer had anywhere to go. Owen had been born 3 years later, during a brief marriage that did not survive the weight of a man who worked 3 jobs and could not stop thinking about an engine he had been forbidden to discuss. When the marriage ended, Caleb had taken Owen and the tools he had managed to accumulate and had moved to Nevada, where the cost of renting a garage space was low enough that he could afford it while still covering rent on the apartment 2 miles away. He had spent the years since then doing what engineers do when the industry closes its doors. He had found the work that existed below the industry's notice, rebuilding carburetors and sorting suspension geometry and doing the invisible skilled labor that keeps older vehicles alive. He was good at it. He was very good at it, actually. But it was not Phoenix. And on the morning he walked into that Henderson auction yard, it had been 14 years since anyone in the automotive world had known his name. Owen, on the drive home with the burned Aventador, chained to the flatbed trailer they had rented from a hardware store parking lot, had asked his father why, if he had built something that important, they lived the way they lived. Caleb had thought about the question for a long time before answering. He had said that sometimes the person who is right is not the person who wins. Owen had looked out the window at the Nevada desert and said that did not seem fair. Caleb had agreed that it did not. The garage on Mojave Court was 12 feet wide and 22 feet deep, a space that had once been used for storing landscaping equipment and that Caleb had converted, over the course of several years, into a functional automotive workshop through a combination of ingenuity and the particular stubbornness of a man who cannot stop working. The walls were hung with tools arranged in the specific order that Caleb's hands had memorized. The floor had 3 layers of paint on it from 3 different phases of his occupation, and the smell was the permanent compound of motor oil and solvent and metal dust that accumulates in a space where real work happens every day. When the burned Aventador was winched off the trailer and positioned under the 2,000-watt work lights, the contrast between the machine and the space it now occupied was almost violent. This was not where a Lamborghini belonged. Caleb did not care about that. He put on his work gloves and began. The first thing he confirmed, with his hands on the actual components rather than his eyes on the burn pattern, was that the primary engine control unit had been replaced. Not damaged, replaced. The mounting hardware was different from OEM specification, and the wiring harness connectors showed the tooling marks of careful disconnection rather than the blast damage of a fire. The telemetry module, which in a car of this specification would sit adjacent to the ECU and log every operational parameter in real time, was simply gone, bracket and all, with thread damage on 2 of the 4 mounting points consistent with hasty removal under time pressure. These discoveries were significant. An ECU replacement and a missing telemetry module in a fire-damaged vehicle could, in theory, have innocent explanations. Insurance investigators sometimes pulled modules, and previous owner modifications were not uncommon. But they confirmed the direction of Caleb's thinking, which had been moving toward a very specific conclusion since the moment he had seen the burn pattern in the auction yard. The second discovery was more important. Buried in the core of the engine block, in the ceramic composite channel that Caleb himself had specified as a thermal isolation layer for Phoenix's central processing hardware, was a ceramic shielding assembly that was structurally intact. Ceramic composite of that specification failed at sustained temperatures above approximately 1,100 degrees Celsius. The fact that it was undamaged meant one thing with absolute certainty: the core of the engine block had never reached those temperatures during the fire. Which meant the fire, whatever it had consumed on the exterior of the car, had never been a true engine fire. It had been a surface fire, intense, devastating in appearance, and almost perfectly designed to make an investigator conclude that the car had suffered a catastrophic internal thermal event when in fact the most important internal components had been protected, and in some cases deliberately preserved. Beneath the destruction, Alexandra Pierce had built Blackline Automotive Auctions over 9 years by being the most technically literate person in any room she walked into. She was 34 years old, stood 5 feet 9 in flat shoes, and had the particular energy of someone who had learned early that the most dangerous thing she could do was let people underestimate her. She ran her auctions with a precision that the dealers who used her platform occasionally found exhausting and always respected. She had become aware of the Henderson auction's odd result. A burned Aventador sold to an unknown buyer for $1,200 through her standard post-auction analytics review, and had initially filed it as a curiosity. Then a short video clip of Caleb examining the car in what appeared to be a residential garage had come to her attention. She watched it 3 times. The second time, she started taking notes. By the third time, she had opened Blackline's internal database and pulled the provenance file on the Aventador's insurance claim history. What she found made her call her head of acquisitions and tell him to clear her afternoon. The provenance file showed that the Aventador had been submitted as a total loss claim to Apex International Insurance at a declared replacement value of $1.4 million. Standard process for a vehicle of that category. The claim had been processed and paid within 11 days fast, but not unusually fast. What was unusual was the serial number. When Alexandra cross-referenced it against the confidential auction registry that Blackline maintained for high-value insurance salvage, the Aventador's chassis number returned a flag she had never seen before, a notation from an anonymous submission 8 years ago, listing the vehicle as a prototype unit that had been registered under a production VIN for reasons the submitter described as irregular. The notation included a name that had been partially redacted. 2 of the remaining letters were C and W. Caleb, meanwhile, had gone deeper into the engine block, and in the space behind the firewall, in a recess that existed in no published engineering diagram because it had been added by hand during prototype assembly, he had found a serial number engraved into the raw metal with a hand tool. The characters were small and deliberate and unmistakably his own work, a habit he had developed as a young engineer in Italy, of leaving a mark on components he was proud of, in places where only someone who had built the thing would know to look. He sat back on his heels in the garage and looked at the number for a long time. Owen, who had been organizing fasteners in the corner, looked up at his father's face and understood, without being told, that something significant had just happened. Sebastian Hale learned about the Henderson sale from a subordinate at Apex International's claims processing division who had been running routine monitoring on salvage auction outcomes for vehicles in the company's liability portfolio. The call came on a Tuesday morning, and Sebastian had taken it in his office on the 42nd floor of a building in downtown Phoenix while looking at the framed photographs on his credenza, cars he had backed, events he had sponsored, the careful documentation of a career built on knowing which risks were worth taking and which ones needed to be made to disappear. The name of the buyer at Henderson did not appear in the auction records. That was not unusual. Many buyers at salvage auctions operated through shell entities or used cash transactions to preserve anonymity. But the description of the buyer, single male, early 40s, accompanied by a child, drove a late-model pickup, spent nearly 40 minutes examining the car before bidding, had caused something to move in Sebastian's chest that he recognized as the specific anxiety of a man who has spent years making sure a certain door stays closed, who has just heard footsteps on the other side. He made 3 calls in sequence. The first was to his attorney. The second was to the asset recovery firm Apex retained for sensitive matters. The third was to a former contact at Lamborghini's North American division, a conversation conducted entirely in implication, in which Sebastian established that certain historical records relating to a specific prototype might need to be reviewed for completeness, and that any individuals who had been associated with that prototype's development should be, as he put it, flagged for monitoring. The asset recovery firm arrived at Mojave Court 4 days later, 2 men in a gray sedan, carrying an offer letter on Apex letterhead. The offer was $50,000 for the vehicle and its contents. No questions asked, transaction to be completed within 48 hours. Caleb read the letter twice, folded it in thirds, and handed it back through the window of the sedan without speaking. He understood exactly what the offer meant. The vehicle itself was worth considerably more than $50,000 in rebuilt form, and any knowledgeable buyer would have known that. The offer was not about the vehicle. It was about the data, specifically about what data might still be recoverable from a prototype unit that had been burned and then sold at public auction to someone who had no business knowing what it contained. The fact that the offer had arrived before Caleb had told anyone what he had found in the engine bay meant that someone had been watching, and that they already knew, at minimum, that the car was the wrong car to have been put through a standard insurance disposal process. The break-in happened on a Thursday night, 2 weeks after the purchase. Caleb had taken Owen to his school's science fair and returned home at 9:30 in the evening to find the garage's side door standing open and the portable hard drive he kept on the workbench missing. The camera he had installed above the door had been physically removed from its mount. His laptop was on the floor, its screen cracked, and the folder he had been using to archive his preliminary findings had been accessed and deleted, though the person who had done it had not known about the secondary backup system Caleb had been running since the second day of the teardown, housed on a server that sat behind the water heater in the apartment utility closet, accessible only through a local network connection that had no external IP address. What they had taken was a mirror of a mirror. What they had not found was everything that mattered. Owen, coming through the door behind his father and seeing the garage in its violated state, had stopped walking and stood very still. When Caleb turned to look at him, Owen's expression was not fear, it was the specific resolve of a 9-year-old who has decided that being frightened is a luxury he cannot afford. He told his father that he was not scared of burned cars. He said the only thing that scared him was watching his father walk away from something again. Caleb looked at his son for a long time. Then he turned back to the garage and began cataloging what had been taken. Whoever had sent the men to search the garage had been looking for a specific compartment. Caleb could tell by the pattern of the search which surfaces had been disturbed, which panels had been removed and then reseated, which recesses had been probed. They had been systematic, and they had been close, but they had not known where the secondary enclosure was. They had not known to look inside the thermal management housing, inside the ceramic channel, inside the specific recess that only the engineer who had designed the Phoenix system would have known to excavate. The thing that was still in there was the thing that Sebastian Hale had spent 14 years hoping would never be found. The capsule was made of grade 5 titanium, machined to a wall thickness of approximately 4 millimeters, sealed with a ceramic gasket compound that Caleb had sourced from the aerospace industry, specifically because it maintained its integrity at temperatures sufficient to destroy everything around it. He had made it himself, in the prototype assembly phase, because he had known, with the cold clarity of an engineer who has been told his safety objections will be ignored, that he needed a record of what the system actually was, separate from any official documentation that could be altered or destroyed. Inside the capsule, sealed in a nitrogen atmosphere and wrapped in a mylar layer, were 3 items: a micro SD card containing the original Phoenix firmware build with its unmodified thermal parameters and timestamp metadata, a second card containing the complete dataset from the prototype's internal test cycle, including the 3 sessions where the thermal runaway condition had been triggered and documented, and a folded piece of paper on which Caleb had written, by hand, the date, his name, and a single sentence describing what the data represented. He sat in the garage for a very long time after opening it. The data was exactly what he had archived. The timestamps were intact, unmodified, belonging to a period 14 years in the past. The test records showed, with the unambiguous precision of engineering data, that the Phoenix system had exhibited catastrophic thermal behavior on 3 separate occasions during controlled testing, and that those test results had been documented, escalated, and then deliberately removed from the official project record before the vehicle was cleared for production. The firmware image showed, in its raw hexadecimal structure, the difference between the version Caleb had submitted for safety review and the version that had ultimately been flashed to production units, a difference of fewer than 200 lines of code, representing the removal of the thermal cutoff that Caleb had built as the system's last line of protection. The worst part of what the data showed was not the cover-up. The worst part was a cross-reference that Caleb had not anticipated finding, a log entry from a post-production incident report that referenced a single vehicle accident in the Mojave Desert, 4 years after the car's launch, in which a driver had been killed when his Aventador suffered a catastrophic thermal event. The incident had been classified as driver error by the insurer. The insurer had been Apex International. The claim had been handled by Sebastian Hale's division. Caleb did not speak for the better part of an hour. He sat with the capsule in his hands and the data on the screen in front of him, and he thought about a driver whose name he did not know, who had died in a desert 70 miles from where he was sitting now, because a safety system that Caleb had designed and then been prevented from completing had failed in exactly the way Caleb had warned it would fail. He thought about the NDA he had signed, and about what signing it had cost beyond his career. He thought about Owen asleep in the apartment 2 miles away, and about the fact that his son had told him, 3 hours ago, that he was afraid of watching his father give up again. He closed the laptop. He picked up his phone and called Alexandra Pierce. Alexandra met him the next morning at a coffee shop 3 miles from the garage. She had brought a legal pad and her laptop and the expression of someone who has made a decision before arriving and is prepared to defend it. She had spent the previous 48 hours pulling every publicly available document associated with the Aventador's chassis number, with Apex International's claims history in the high-performance vehicle category, and with the corporate structure of the investment consortium that had backed the Phoenix Project's commercialization. What she had found had convinced her, before she sat down across from Caleb Walker, that the story was real, that the risk was significant, and that she was going to help. She was not a romantic. She was not someone who made decisions based on sympathy or sentiment, and she would have been the first to say so. What moved her, in the days that followed as she worked alongside Caleb through the documentation and the data, was something more durable than sympathy. It was recognition. She recognized what it looked like when a person had been systematically stripped of something they had built with their own hands, because she had survived a version of that herself, earlier in her career, and she had learned from it that the most important thing a person could do in that situation was refuse to pretend it had not happened. Caleb had not pretended. For 14 years, in a small garage, with a child and a collection of hand tools and the specific stubbornness of a man who could not stop knowing what he knew, he had simply waited for the moment when the truth needed a witness. Alexandra intended to be that witness. She connected him with an attorney named Marcus Webb, who specialized in intellectual property fraud and corporate liability in the automotive sector. Marcus reviewed the capsule data and the firmware comparison and the incident report cross-reference over a 72-hour period, and then called Alexandra to tell her, in the precise language of someone who has seen a great deal and is trying to remain measured, that what they had was extraordinary. He also told her that Sebastian Hale would come at them hard, and that they needed to be prepared for the counterattack before they made a single public move. Sebastian moved first. He filed an emergency injunction claiming that Caleb was in possession of proprietary trade secrets belonging to Lamborghini's parent company and was in violation of the non-disclosure agreement he had signed 14 years prior. The filing was accompanied by a press statement from Apex International characterizing Caleb as a disgruntled former contractor who had stolen confidential documents during his termination and was now using them to extort a legitimate insurance company. The automotive press, which had never heard of Caleb Walker, reported the injunction without context, and for approximately 72 hours the story was the one Sebastian had written, a failed engineer making trouble for a respected institution. Caleb responded through Marcus with a counterfiling that attached the timestamp metadata from the capsule's micro SD cards, establishing with cryptographic certainty that the files had been created and sealed before Caleb's employment was terminated, and that they therefore could not constitute stolen post-termination material. He also submitted a technical declaration, 43 pages in length, that walked through the firmware comparison line by line and demonstrated the specific modifications that had been made to the Phoenix system between his final safety submission and the production build. Alexandra, for her part, had been preparing something different. She organized a live technical demonstration in Blackline's main auction facility, not a press conference, not a statement, but an open teardown, conducted with the Aventador on a lift under professional lighting, during which Caleb walked through the physical evidence, while Marcus's team documented everything on video. She invited credentialed automotive engineers, insurance investigators, and legal observers. She also made the event open to the public, because she understood that the story's best protection was visibility. The room was full. Caleb stood in front of the burned Aventador and talked about combustion engineering the way a man talks about something he loves when he has spent years not being allowed to say its name. He was not angry. He was precise. and the precision was more devastating than anger would have been. He showed the burn pattern. He showed the empty module brackets. He showed the ceramic shielding and explained what its survival proved about the fire's origin and nature. He showed the capsule. He showed the firmware comparison on a screen large enough for the back row to read. When he reached the section of his presentation where he cross-referenced the fatal accident with the incident report and explained, in engineering terms, how the two were connected, there was a silence in the room that lasted nearly a full minute. A former senior engineer from Lamborghini's thermal dynamics group, a man named Dr. Alan Frost, who had been retired for 6 years and had traveled from New Mexico to be there, stood up during the open question period and said that he could corroborate the existence of the Phoenix project and the nature of the safety objections that had been raised during its development phase. He said that he had been prepared to provide this testimony under oath in any legal proceeding that required it. He said that he had waited a long time to be asked. 3 days later, on his way to a preliminary legal deposition, Dr. Frost was involved in a single-vehicle accident on a rural highway outside Santa Fe. He survived, but the coincidence was not lost on anyone following the case, and it was not lost on the insurance fraud investigators at the state level who had, by that point, opened their own inquiry into Apex International's claims handling practices. The rebuild of the Aventador was not something Caleb had planned. It emerged from the same logic that had driven everything else, the understanding that a thing was not finished simply because someone had tried to destroy it. He had the chassis, which was structurally sound beneath the fire damage. He had the engine block, which was intact at its core. He had the capsule's firmware, the original Phoenix build, the version that had never been released because it included the thermal cutoff that made it safe. He had his own hands and 14 years of accumulated knowledge and a 9-year-old son who had started sitting on an upturned bucket in the corner of the garage every afternoon after school, asking questions about everything Caleb touched. The rebuild took 4 months. The carbon fiber body panels had to be replaced entirely, and Caleb sourced them from a specialist supplier in Arizona who agreed to work at cost when Caleb explained what the car was. The drivetrain components that had been damaged by the fire were meticulously inspected and either restored or replaced with OEM parts procured through Marcus's legal team, which had obtained a court order permitting access to Lamborghini's North American parts inventory for the purpose of evidence preservation. The V12 engine, when Caleb finally addressed it as a complete assembly, was in better condition than its exterior had suggested. The ceramic shielding had done its job, and the core of the powertrain had been largely protected from the temperatures that had destroyed the car's surface. Caleb worked on the engine for 3 weeks, running through every component with the thoroughness of someone who is not merely restoring a machine but testifying through it. The Phoenix firmware was the last thing he installed. He calibrated it over 6 days using a data logger he had built himself from components that cost less than $800 total, running the engine on a stand at progressively higher loads while monitoring the thermal response at 28 measurement points across the combustion system. The original firmware, with its thermal cutoff intact, performed exactly as he had designed it to perform 14 years ago. It was not merely functional. It was remarkable, smooth at low RPM in a way that production V12 engines were not, and at the top of the rev range it produced a sound and a response that was categorically different from anything that had ever come out of a factory. Owen, who had been present for the first full engine run, had stood next to his father in the garage with his hands over his ears and a look of pure astonishment on his face as the revs climbed, and when Caleb shut it down he had asked, in the ringing silence that followed, whether that was what all engines were supposed to sound like. Caleb had told him no. He said that was what this one was supposed to sound like, before someone decided it was not worth the time to do it right. Alexandra organized the final auction on a Friday evening in February, in the main hall of Blackline's facility in Scottsdale. The invitation list included 18 serious collectors, 4 engineering journalists from major automotive publications, representatives from 2 competing European manufacturers, 2 separate insurance fraud investigation teams, and a documentary film crew that Alexandra had given access to the entire process over the preceding 6 weeks. She had also invited Sebastian Hale, through his attorney, because she believed that a man who had spent 14 years benefiting from a lie deserved to watch the truth be made public in person. Sebastian declined. He sent his attorney instead. The legal landscape by the time of the auction had shifted substantially. The state insurance fraud investigation had expanded into a federal inquiry following the disclosure of the incident report and its connection to the driver's death in the Mojave Desert. 3 former Apex International employees had come forward as cooperating witnesses, including 2 claims adjusters who had worked on the original vehicle disposal process and 1 senior analyst who had been present for the internal review that classified the desert fatality as driver error. Lamborghini's parent company had opened a formal internal investigation and had retained independent counsel. Sebastian Hale had resigned from his position at Apex International 12 days before the auction, in a statement that his publicist described as a retirement and that no one believed. The Aventador was revealed at the center of the hall under a single overhead light, and Caleb walked out beside it in the same canvas work jacket he had worn to the Henderson auction 3 months earlier. He had been offered a new suit by 3 separate people. He had declined all 3. Alexandra stood at the podium and spoke for approximately 4 minutes about the history of the vehicle, the nature of the evidence that had been recovered from it, and the legal proceedings that were ongoing. Then she stepped back and gave the floor to Caleb. He spoke for 11 minutes. He did not read from notes. He talked about combustion systems and thermal mapping, and the specific beauty of an engine that had been designed to be honest about what it was capable of. He talked about a driver who had died in a desert because a deadline had been more important than a safety calculation. He said that he had never wanted to destroy anyone's company or anyone's career. He said that he had wanted, from the beginning, only for the work to be done correctly and for the truth of what the work had been to survive. Then he walked to the car, opened the driver's door, and started the engine. The sound that came out of that rebuilt V12 in the enclosed auction hall was something that the people present would describe differently for years afterward. Some said it was frightening. Some said it was the most alive thing they had ever heard from a machine. A retired engineer in the 3rd row put his hands flat on his thighs and did not move for the duration of the idle. Alexandra, standing at the side of the room, watched the people in the hall and thought about what it meant to hear something true after a very long time of hearing only approximations of it. The bidding opened at $300,000 and closed, after 22 minutes, at $1.8 million. Sebastian Hale was arrested at Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport on a Tuesday morning, 7 weeks after the auction. He was attempting to board a flight to Zurich carrying 2 carry-on bags and a laptop that his attorney would later argue had been wiped, though the federal forensics team recovered sufficient data from the drive's allocation tables to add 3 additional counts to the indictment. The charges, as filed, included insurance fraud, evidence tampering, obstruction of a federal investigation, and civil conspiracy in connection with the misrepresentation of the Mojave Desert fatality. Apex International's stock price fell 62% over the following 10 trading days. 3 board members resigned in a single afternoon. The company's general counsel issued a statement acknowledging that an internal review had identified significant irregularities in the handling of claims associated with the Phoenix Project vehicles, which was a carefully worded way of confirming that everything Caleb had said was true. The automotive press, which had described Caleb as a disgruntled former contractor 3 months earlier, now described him as a whistleblower, a genius, and a symbol of institutional integrity. He gave 2 interviews in the week following the arrest, one to an engineering journal and one to a general interest publication, and in both of them he was quiet, specific, and careful. He did not use the word vindication. He did not talk about revenge. When the engineering journalist asked him how it felt to have his name back, Caleb thought for a moment and said that his name had never gone anywhere. He said the work had never gone anywhere. He said the capsule had been in that engine block for 14 years, and the data inside it had been exactly what it was for all 14 of those years, unchanged, regardless of whether anyone was looking. Owen was present for both interviews. He sat in a chair against the wall with a book on his lap that he was not reading, watching his father with the focused attention of a child who is understanding, in real time, something important about the world. After the second journalist left, Owen came and stood next to Caleb at the workbench where Caleb had been cleaning a carburetor while they talked, because Caleb could not sit still during conversations and preferred to have his hands occupied. Owen asked his father whether he was glad that people knew now. Caleb looked at the carburetor for a moment. He said it did not matter much to him whether people knew. He said what mattered was that Owen knew. Owen had rolled his eyes in the way of a 9-year-old who suspects he is being given a meaningful answer and is not entirely sure how to receive it. But he had also smiled. 6 months after the auction, the garage on Mojave Court had a new sign above its roll-up door. The sign was simple, white letters on a dark background, without decoration. Walker Engineering. The space itself had been modestly expanded, a second bay had been added to the original footprint, and a used dynamometer occupied the far wall. Sourced from a closing performance shop in Tucson and recalibrated by Caleb over the course of 2 weekends. The tools were the same ones that had always been on the walls. The smell was the same compound of oil and metal and solvent. What was different was the light, better lighting, purchased specifically because Owen had complained for years that the original fluorescence made it hard to read part numbers on small components. Alexandra Pierce had become a formal partner in the enterprise, providing the capital investment that had enabled the expansion in exchange for a minority equity stake and a role as Caleb's interface with the commercial side of the business. It was a partnership built not on sentiment but on the specific compatibility of two people who were very good at different things and who had the rare quality of trusting each other's judgment outside their own area of expertise. They had built, alongside the workshop operation, a small fund for engineering education that paid for tools and materials for technical students at 3 community colleges in the Phoenix metropolitan area. Alexandra ran the fund. Caleb occasionally visited the programs and talked to students about combustion systems in the direct, unperforming way of someone who is talking because the subject itself is worth talking about. He received serious offers from Ferrari, from Porsche, and from a Swedish manufacturer who had been following the Phoenix case with particular interest and who sent a handwritten letter describing, in technical detail, a problem they had been working on for 3 years that they believed Caleb was uniquely positioned to solve. He read all the letters carefully. He replied to all of them. He declined all of them, though he left the door open with the Swedish firm for a consulting arrangement that would allow him to work from Scottsdale rather than relocating. He had moved once in pursuit of the work. He was not going to do it again. On a Wednesday afternoon in early spring, Caleb was underneath a 1986 Chevrolet pickup that belonged to a retired teacher from 2 streets over when a boy appeared at the open garage door. The boy was perhaps 7 years old, wearing a red jacket, and he was pushing a go-kart with a small single-cylinder engine that had clearly not run in some time. He stood in the doorway looking at the space with the expression of a child who has found something he recognizes but has never had a name for. Caleb rolled out from under the pickup, sat up, and looked at the go-kart. He asked the boy what the problem was. The boy said it just stopped going one day and he did not know why. Caleb looked at the engine for approximately 30 seconds, identified a fouled main jet, found the appropriate tool from the rack on the wall, and had the carburetor cleaned and reassembled in under 4 minutes. He set the go-kart on the floor, primed the fuel system, and told the boy to pull the cord. The engine caught on the second pull. The boy's face transformed entirely, the way faces do when a thing that was broken becomes suddenly and unexpectedly whole. Owen was standing in the doorway of the second bay, where he had been cataloging a new shipment of specialty fasteners. He watched his father hand the go-kart back to the boy with the matter-of-fact kindness of a man who does not grade the importance of the work by the size of the machine. Owen watched until the boy had gone, and then he stood in the doorway for a moment longer, looking at his father moving back toward the pickup truck, and the expression on his face was not the complicated, watchful expression of a child who has spent years trying to understand a difficult thing. It was something simpler and more complete than that. He went back to the fasteners. People had laughed when Caleb Walker bought a burned Lamborghini for $1,200. They had been right, in their way, that the car itself was gone, the paint, the body, the electronics, the exterior identity of the thing were all truly and irreversibly destroyed. What they had not understood, what none of them in that yard could have known, was that the car had never been the point. The car had been the container. What Caleb had bought, for $1,200, was the proof that the work he had done was real, that the truth of it had survived intact inside a titanium capsule for 14 years, and that a man whose name had been removed from every official record had, in the end, signed his own creation in metal with his own hand, in a place where only he would ever think to look. He had not gone to that auction to save a Lamborghini. He had gone to save something that could not be bought or burned or written out of a patent file, something that had belonged to him since before the system ever had a use for it. He had gone to find his own name.